Welcome to episode 2 of Behind the Bills. I'm Iván Carrillo. Coming up, we have a new state budget. Going to tell you what's in, what's out, everything you need to know. Also ahead, there will be a $10 billion school facilities bond on the November ballot. We'll give you all the details. Plus, we'll tell you about a topic that's getting a lot of state and federal attention: cell phone usage in schools. Find out how this could impact school districts in the coming year. And finally, a conversation with legislative advocate Megan Baier. We'll talk about everything that goes into ACSA's advocacy, as well as how things ultimately get done. So let's jump right in. At long last, we have a state budget. Governor Newsom signed the budget on Saturday, June 29th. And there were a couple of really big victories for schools, things that were central to ACSA's budget advocacy. First off, where things landed related to Proposition 98. On the last episode, I talked about a manipulation that had been proposed that would have had significant impacts on school funding, not only for next year, but for years to come. Ultimately, the budget included prior year funding that was in question and that was being proposed to be left out of the Proposition 98 calculation. So what this means for schools is an additional $5 billion in the year ahead. And why this matters is that it's $5 billion more dollars that are going to go to directly serving students. $5 billion more dollars that are going to improve instruction, that are going to support programs that we know are critical to student success. The significance of this can't be overstated, not only because of what was being proposed back in January by the governor, but also because of the state's fiscal situation. We have a budget shortfall of $50+ billion. There's no cuts to education, and there's $5 billion more in Proposition 98 funding than there was proposed back in January. We're really proud of the work that we did here. ACSA and coalition partners held the line and were unified in pushing back on the proposal. And the message that we continue to communicate is that even in a year like this one, you can't cut schools. You can't cut education. Because if you did, you would compromise all the progress that's been made coming out of the pandemic. Right now is the time to double down on state investments that have been made, not to strip away funding that is so critically important to schools and the students we serve. One more thing on the budget. Back on episode 1, we told you about a proposal related to emergency school closures that would have withheld school funding if remote instruction was not provided within 5 days of an emergency. This is something that ACSA fought really hard on. It was a priority of ours during legislative action days, where our members were telling every member of the legislature of why this was a bad idea. What ultimately was included in the budget are some new steps related to planning for emergency school closures. But ultimately, and importantly, if schools are unable to provide remote instruction, if it's not feasible, then schools will not be financially penalized. This is an example of the power of ACSA's collective advocacy, specifically the importance of the role that our members play, the importance of legislators hearing directly from school leaders within their community. Again, we had hundreds of folks up here during legislative action days, but in addition to that, we had many, many more members using their voice to voice opposition to the proposal that had been put forth. And ultimately, that played the difference. Another major win for ACSA and school communities is that there will be a state bond in November. This has been a top priority for us, as we know there is desperate need to build new schools and to update outdated facilities. The school bond will be $10 billion. It's going to include funding for K-12 along with community colleges. Notably, the CSUs and the UCs were left out. If the UCs and CSUs would have been included, it would have meant dramatically less funding for K-12 schools. And so we're happy with how things played out there. Also notable is the support for small school districts, providing technical assistance for smalls, but also having a 10% set aside so small school districts aren't competing with larger, more resourced ones. Another win is greater support for school communities with lower bonding capacity. We know that every school community is not in a position where they can pass local bonds, local facility bonds. And so this proposition takes recognition of that and provides additional support to these communities. So now our attention turns to November. We need to make sure that this passes. We're going to uplift stories that demonstrate the need. We're going to build support with other partners. And we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we convince voters that it is a good investment. Before we get to our conversation with Megan, cell phone use in schools. The U.S. Surgeon General recently came out with a statement talking about how social media use by youth has a negative impact on their mental health. Immediately following that statement, the governor came on record to express his support for limiting the use of cell phones by students during school hours. ACSA has been leading in this space. We are the co-sponsors of a bill that would prohibit social media companies from targeting kids with addictive algorithms. But what you need to know is that there are two approaches to addressing this issue. There are some legislators who believe that the responsibility lies with school districts, that school districts need to have policies to restrict or limit cell phone use during schools. There is another camp, which is the camp that ACSA supports, which believes the responsibility lies with social media companies, that social media companies need to do more to protect young people. Part of this includes social media companies having to remove bullying, threatening, and abusive posts. We've heard countless stories from school leaders who tell us about these really troubling social media posts that they and parents report to social media companies and nothing happens. And they live out there and continue to have negative effect on kids and school communities. What we want to do is make sure that social media companies take responsibility and ultimately take these hurtful posts down. Happy to be joined by ACSA legislative advocate Megan Baier. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, Iván. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to engage in this conversation. Before we jump into just pulling back the curtain, so to speak, on budget advocacy and just all things budget, for our listeners, I'd like you to just talk a little bit about your background and what were you doing prior to joining ACSA?
So before I joined ACSA, I spent 10 years working in the legislature, working for a handful of different members. But right before I came, I was working for the former pro tem, Tony Atkins, and I covered all K-12 and higher education issues for her. So that was from working on the budget to legislative issues, audits, pretty much every function within the legislature on behalf of the pro tem.
So you obviously know the budget process from your experience very well, and I things have definitely changed in that realm. And can you speak to that a little bit? Just how the budget process now is different than what it was when you were working in the Capitol?
The process evolves over time, and I think, sometimes we feel like it's stagnant, but, different leadership, different world events, shape how the process looks. Before COVID had a huge effect on what the budget process looked like. Pre-COVID, we had, folks might remember conference committees and really long hearings where the legislature spelled out different line items and it highlighted differences between the Senate and Assembly. And then there was concurrent negotiation going on with the governor to come to a three-party agreement. During COVID, because of, in 2020, all the restrictions and congregating together, a lot of that fell away. So, we now see both houses adopt their own legislative budget. The practice has become for the two houses to come to an agreement, which they then send to the governor. And then that allows them more time to negotiate a final three-party deal. I think while we expect a June 15th budget, and that became the norm, the statute actually only requires that the legislature send the governor a budget. It doesn't require that there be a final budget. So, it's kind of a little workaround that the legislature and the governor have used in recent years to allow themselves more time to negotiate.
It's interesting when you say three-party deal. It used to almost mean the governor and Democratic and Republican leadership, but dynamics and makeup of the legislature, have really changed. Just who's in that mix in terms of the ultimate outcome, right?
Yeah, I mean, not only the makeup has changed, we have, supermajorities. That wasn't as common before, but the voters also passed an initiative where the budget only has to be passed by a simple majority, right? So, that's another part of that reason why that's evolved. And it's the Senate, Assembly, and the governor are really the big three there.
This year was pretty unique in terms of the dynamics. We're coming off of multiple years of major surpluses, and this year the state was in a very different, fiscal situation. Whether it be in that line of thinking or just in any other way, how was this year's budget different than prior year budgets?
Well, the last few years, we've seen historic revenue highs. It's given the legislature opportunity to invest in programs that have been priorities for a lot of constituencies for a long time. In our space, that's universal transitional kindergarten, it's universal meals, it's expanded learning, having after-school care and intercession care accessible to all families. So these major program expansions, this year revenues fell significantly. We had a misalignment last year with tax extensions that didn't align to our budget cycle. So essentially the legislature estimated where they thought revenues were going to be. They were very wrong. And then they had to grapple with the consequences of that. So we had this combo of we thought we had more money than we did and we overspent. Combined with a slowing economy. So it was a very different budget context. By and large, most programs were protected, but really this year was about defense and protecting investments that have been made in terms of the programs that districts have built out and trying to preserve those key student programs, making sure our local control funding formula was fully funded, protecting Prop 98, making sure that was fully funded. So it was a very different budget year.
Our budget work, it feels like it's year round, essentially, right? And really picks up late fall and then continues all the way through budget adoption in late June. Those victories that you're talking about and that were highlighted earlier in the show, I mean, how do we get there? What does the budget advocacy look like? Can you speak to that a little bit? Our members' involvement, the work of the governmental relations team. How are we able to achieve success and ultimately get a budget that reflects ACSA's priorities?
It is a year-round process. The legislature goes into an interim, so they're not meeting on a regular basis in the fall, but here at ACSA, we are meeting with our members a lot. We're identifying local priorities, identifying issues that came up as a result of actions from the previous legislative year. We're formulating our platform, so there's a lot of base building work. At the same time, we're keeping an eye on state revenues. What are things looking like? What are the opportunities and challenges for the years ahead? So really the fall is the time that at ACSA we start building out what that platform is going to look like and thinking through that advocacy. And then, of course, in January, the governor makes his proposal, proposing what programmatic and fiscal policy changes he'd like to see for the coming year. So for us, it's both member-driven, but also we have to react to what the governor is proposing and soliciting the feedback of our members and keeping that front and center as we go into the budget year. And then ultimately, with the many hearings over the course of a few months, and then ultimately a budget adoption in end of June.
Whether it be policy or budget, I mean, you and I know that relationships are critical to us being able to get things done. What type of relationships, whether it be our relationships or our members' relationships, are important in this process?
Relationships really are important at every level, and it's from, our level as individual advocates with, various staff members and legislators, but it's also ACSA members' relationships. It's, those members' relationships with their local legislator. So when there is a problematic piece of legislation or a really important piece of legislation, there's that connection to their local constituency. So, I think one of our big goals here as an association is to foster those, strong, positive relationships at every level, so that when, we need support or opposition, that we can call and that the legislator will pick up the phone and help us out.
Let's move on to just timing of budget adoption and its relation to school calendars. We talk about after every budget cycle, right, that these changes that are included aren't ideal and that they're problematic. What do you hear in relation to this?
Yeah, the budget process is really misaligned with our school calendars. So, budget adoption happens at the end of June. Sometimes there's cleanup or, more minor, sometimes major changes, even as late as August. Our members are on summer break, hopefully taking some time to be with their families. They come back to school. They're focused on back to school. And often these changes that happen through the budget catch them off guard. The other thing about the budget process is, most legislation, when it's signed, it goes into effect January 1 of the following year. So you have a couple months of a lead up. The budget is not like that. As soon as the governor signs it, it becomes law. So, I think quite notoriously, that's how we had during the pandemic. The independent study changes really kind of rocked our worlds because there was massive changes made to independent study via the budget process. And a lot of the changes even happened in August when most schools had already started. So it's something that we are always on the lookout for as advocates. And we work really hard to try to put out information every year. Here's what the changes are. But that's, it's one of the things our members need to keep an eye on, and they need to know is that there's always going to be a few changes in the budget. And it's really important to make sure that you know what there is, and if you need to make some changes at the local level to some board policies or otherwise, that you're on top of it.
Yeah, this year is definitely no exception, and I'll just put in a plug for our comprehensive budget summary that's available on the ACSA Resource Hub. So please take a look there to our members for a summary of the notable changes here this year. Megan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for episode 2 of Behind the Bills. Thanks to everyone behind the scenes who worked on the show. Be sure to review and subscribe to this podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time.